Hello, Matthew. I continue my view. I continue to share my perspective on your videos about German idealism, and here I'm at the third video. And the way I define myself as of now, I know that I am what Hegel calls the negative, but I also know that I am in the process of my development. I am at the stage of reason. I know that the world is rational and that I am a singular consciousness which becomes aware of the whole of reality, and that I must find myself within reality. And I know that someday you will understand me, and you will understand Hegel, and you will understand yourself, and you will understand the world. And yeah, but I also know that I know enough about Hegel to know that at this moment in time, we're the 21st of March, when I say I am the negative, I am reason, it is completely unintelligible for the other to which I'm talking. It's part of the process. But yeah. So you talk in this video number 3 about Fichte. And I will give you my personal experience with Fichte. And I know that I should try to talk in a scientific, logical, systematic order. But I am not intelligent enough, and I must try to rationalize my understanding of reality, because language, whether we like it or not, contains hidden logical categories. So I must try to be as coherent, logical, universal as possible, while knowing that I am trapped within an empirical self which is tainted by his cognitive limitations, his experience, the state of his body. When I'm tired, I speak with less coherence, I make mistakes, but I must extract the logical thoughts out of the tainted medium of language. So this empirical individual, in August 2018, I had my first glimpse of what I called the absolute in January 2018. And that's when I discovered Hegel. And I became fully Hegelian from February to August. I was fully plunged into Hegel. I read Hegel, but I read mostly the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, but I had the view that Hegel was the most brilliant genius ever. And I made an experiment in August 2018 when I had, for the past 12 months, I had many what I called mystical experiences, which was a feeling that my mind was connected with the world. I would later understand that when I grasped speculative ideas, the subject and the object kind of became one. That's speculative logic. But I did not understand that back then. And my mystical experiences occurred most of the time during the full moon. I was shivering and quivering and being moved and being my spiritual life was connected somehow with the movements of the moon, and during the moonlight, the full moon, I had mystical insights. And then I started to say, oh, maybe that's why people say the people are lunatic, and that's the stories of werewolves come from, those who transform into werewolves during the full moon or something like that. I started to wonder, is there some hidden rationality in the folk tales? Maybe there is, but anyway. And in the middle of the night, in this month of August, I had been thinking about Hegel and quantum physics and the eternal essence of woman and alchemy, and I looked at the moon, the full moon, in the middle of the night, and I said to myself, what I see in the light of the moon is the reflection of the light of the sun. And I realized that the light of the sun was my own light, and I had some sort of a mystical insight, and I thought of myself as being the consciousness of reality. And this is what I called the Fichte moment, because I was vaguely acquainted and vaguely familiar with Die Bestimmung des Menschen, the purpose of man or the destiny of man by Fichte. And at the beginning of the book, he says that he wants his reader to elevate himself above the sensuous and to become the self, das Ich, the I, the self, which speaks in this book. And I said, that's a strange endeavor to demand from your reader that the reader shall become a higher self, which transcends the empirical self. And I made the thought experiment, and I said to myself, I am this higher self, and reality is a product of my consciousness. And yeah. And I had the vision or the understanding, I don't know, of a God, because I identified this consciousness of the whole of reality with God, and I had the vision of a God who was lost, a God who did not know how he arrived here, where he was going to, who he was. I felt lost. And there are two authors of which I know and with which I am familiar who had an experience of penetrating into the mind of God and not knowing who they were, what reality was, and who were lost within the mind of God. And these two men are Fichte and Philip K. Dick. And I have an infinite love for these minds because I recognize myself in them. And I later realized and discovered that what happened at this moment, when I had this understanding of my the unity of myself with the whole of reality, is what Hegel calls the birth of reason, the singular consciousness which becomes aware that reality is its own world, its own reality. And yeah, and later I forgot, and yeah, but yeah. And you said in your video that the absolute self, which I will call the Fichtean self, which is actually reason, as Hegel understands it, has a will to annihilate otherness, to remove the distinction between the subject and the object. And in everyday experience, every consciousness wants to remove otherness by activity. When we eat, we negate the food and we incorporate the food within ourselves. When we work, when we build a building or a house, or when we write something on a piece of paper, we negate the blank aspect of the sheet of paper and we incorporate our own selfhood in the form of our own language and our own ideas on the sheet of paper. So every human singular consciousness is moved by a will and a desire to exteriorize itself and to give itself a presence and to negate the negative of itself, to recognize itself. That's the desire and the movement of all reality. But the higher and violence in the form of the will to radically negate the other through violent means, by killing and inflicting suffering, is a negative way of negating. But the highest means of negating otherness is through a philosophical understanding, by fully grasping the other, whether it's the other of the mind, which is nature, or the other of the self, which is another consciousness, and to equalize otherness to self by a conceptual work and by fully understanding the determinations of otherness. And this is the process of reason, because reason wants to equalize the world with itself, and spirit, which is the later stage of reason, wants to recognize itself everywhere. And I would like to read a quote from this book, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition. Hopefully it will not be too late when you understand this video, so you will still be able to read the book. I don't know. Hegel's account of selfhood involves the claim that at some level the self relates to its other by willing its cancellation. At the root of all the forms of spirit that unfold in the phenomenology is a primal demonic drive for complete possession or mastery of the object, for, in effect, the annihilation of otherness. By implication, this drive is simultaneously a will to remove the divide between subject and object, for by cancelling otherness, it seeks to exalt the self. It is the vocation of mankind or spirit to transform the given world, to make it conform to ID, to remove the distinction between real and ideal, subject and object. For Hegel, it is not enough for spirit to change the world, it must interpret it. And I must be honest with myself. I have this negative will within myself to equalize myself with the other by a conceptual act, by an intellectual act. I want to understand the other so well that I can say you are identical with me in mind. And that's the reason why I'm producing these videos, in case you hadn't understood yet. And I know that this is partly evil, but at the same time it is an evil will which produces freedom and joy also, because when you penetrate the mind of the other and you recognize the other as being the reflection of the self, you experience intellectual joy. So yeah. You talk about life as a circular, self-organizing, or maybe that's me, I don't know, where the whole determines the parts. That's an idea in the Kantian and Hegelian sense. It's a conceptual totality which orders, structures, determines the parts of its own totality, and the whole, the totality, precedes and is logically anterior to the parts. And in this sense, God is life, and life is divine in this sense. Organic life is a reflection, a mirror image of the life of the logical idea, because what Hegel calls the idea is a self-moving, self-initiating, self-organizing process of it is an impulse which is at the root of logical necessity to find determinations within pure being, which is pure nothing, and this urge to find something within nothing is the root of all the logical determinations that follow, because every concept which is not pure being or which is not absolute is self-contradictory, and it is forced by a negative movement to go out of itself and to transform itself and to surpass itself and to transcend itself until the full logical circle is completed. And then I must believe Hegel, because I'm not yet sure that this is how it happens, but I assume for now that he says that the full self-sustaining logical idea freely exteriorizes itself and becomes nature and alienates itself in a sensuous physical world, which is the reflection of the logical idea. And I have not yet been able to prove that this is the case, but every scientist, atheist, materialist, empiricist scientist presuppose that nature is rational, but they look at nature with the eyes of their Verstand, with categorical, dualistic, Kantian thinking, with symbolic logic in a way, and they do not look at the world through the mind of speculative thinking. But like I said in my previous video, the modern physicists are rediscovering an organic, mysterious for them view of nature, which is how nature should be viewed in a speculative consideration. But for them, consciousness is a product of nature, whereas from a German idealist point of view, it is nature which is a byproduct of consciousness, and that's why consciousness finds itself and recognizes itself within nature, its own rationality. And I think that Schelling said that nature is the poetry of spirit. And then, briefly, the history of modern philosophy. It begins with Descartes, with a radical doubt about the very existence of the external world. The self has to assert its own identity and its own certainty and the foundation of all knowledge by intellectually doubting the very existence of the external world. And Spinoza was influenced by Descartes, but he had the terminology of Descartes, but to presuppose and to demonstrate mathematically the unity of all things within the unity and the rationality of the substance. And Leibniz rebelled, in a way, that's not a proper word, but Leibniz tried to refute Spinoza by asserting the principle of intellectual individuality. So this is the opposition, according to Hegel, between Oriental, Eastern monism, where everything is molded into the unity of the substance, and Western individualism. So, yeah, that's Hegel's view, which is partly true, that individualism, the self-sustaining freedom of the individual is primarily a Western principle in the realm of politics and law and legislation and economics and yeah. And at the end of the 18th century, there was a revival of Spinozism in a romantic way, and it is the revival of Spinoza's philosophy which gave birth to a philosophy of nature, a romantic view of nature. And in this context, we have partly Goethe and Novalis and Lessing and Jacobi, I'm not sure, Moses Mendelssohn. I'm not familiar with these authors, but I know their name and I broadly know their ideas. And in this context, there is Kant, who was an anti-Spinozian, if there ever was one. And Fichte is in the continuation of Kant, but at the same time, he acknowledges in his popular books that Spinozism is the principle of nature and of mind. The Die Bestimmung des Menschen is a Spinozian book which brings about the consciousness of the absolute ego. And in his more philosophical writings, Fichte says that every form of rationalism must necessarily lead to Spinoza's philosophy, and he tried to preserve the individuality and the liberty of the self against the dogmatic rationality of Spinoza. And there we have Schelling, which tries to have a Spinozian view of nature, to revive Spinoza's philosophy in a romantic and speculative way, where the objective is made the absolute, objective idealism. And I know that you are much more familiar with Schelling's philosophy than I am. And in this context, which is it is brought into our consciousness by a historical development, but actually it's a philosophical development, and history is dubious in a sense, because it is consciousness which is the primordial element, but consciousness has to find itself reflected in history, in the history of philosophy and the history of politics also. But there comes Hegel, who tries to reconcile in a dialectical fashion, in a dialectical interaction, the substance of Spinoza and the subject of Leibniz and Fichte. So, and by showing that there is a dialectical reciprocal interaction between the object and the subject, and that they are one but not one, they are separated through the negative. The subject is the negative of the substance, and they must re-establish through a dialectical and logical process their unity with one another and to equalize themselves. And the substance must become absolutely conscious of itself as an absolute subject. And yeah. You say that the crucifix becomes the I for Fichte, and Hegel says that the principle of selfhood, das Ich, is the principle of suffering, because the self is that which is separated from God. And this is the principia individuationis, the becoming of an individual. And it is a process of suffering, and the process of individuation is a process of suffering, because what is a self is separated from an object, which is the not self. And Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, had a mystical view of things, that there was a primordial unity of all things, as that what he calls the I don't know how it's in German, but the original primordial unity is a creative artist who wants to give himself an artistic presence, and that the individual can be molded into this primordial unity. And Nietzsche was a mystical thinker. And you said that the absolute self is more than you and me. And what I am trying to produce with this video, and I know that I will probably fail, but to prove you that my higher self, which is this absolute ego, and your higher self, and both our higher selves are reflected in our best ideas, that they are identical, that the thinking principle living inside you and the thinking principle living inside me when I have good thoughts are one. And you made a video many years ago when you said that the tat zvam sasi, I don't know how you say that, thou art that, you are that you know yourself to be a mirror of and the reflection of this higher self. And I am trying to recognize you and to reunite your higher self with my higher self, which are identical. I am trying to remember you and to remind you of who you are, and I am seeking infinity. And when you read Hegel with the knowledge that I bring you, you will understand that the negative and reason are they are evil partly, but they are also pathetic, because the reason is pathetically trying to reestablish self-identity and infinity with itself, and it fails, and it must fail in the process. And I am this pathetic attempt at reestablishing infinity with myself. And yeah. Evil is the little self, the lower self, which is trapped within itself with its own psychological, empirical existence, and who loves his little self more than the whole, more than the totality. And this is evil. It is the negative, which is trapped within his own empirical selfhood. And I must be honest, evil from the point of view of God, evil is laughable, and one should make fun of the devil, as they call it, or the negative, because the whole, when you, I have not yet experienced it, but hopefully it's true, but the whole is so much greater than the self as an individual. It's infinitely greater. There's not even comparison. So the value of the totality in comparison with the sacrifice of the little self is so much infinitely higher than, from the point of view of the totality becoming conscious of itself, it seems laughable that the negative wanted to grasp with such resistance to his little empirical self, because in the absolute, the negative is irrelevant. But it's easier said than done from the point of view of the negative. But I try to express the point of view of a higher perspective. But yeah. And then you said that the self, from the point of view of Fichte, creates an other. And in the philosophy of Jakob Böhm and Hegel, selfhood, the self-consciousness of one's own self-identity, develops only in relation to the not-self. The self can only become conscious of itself by being conscious of an other which is not the self. But if the other is the necessary condition, the necessary element to the becoming conscious of itself of the self, one could say that the other is a part of the self. And one cannot understand the development of modern politics without understanding that the other, the immigrant, the refugee, the minority, it's in the realm of politics an attempt to help the other of the other, the indigenous natives, or the natives or the indigenous people, or the whites mostly, but not only, to become conscious of themselves. And the process leads to Hegel's philosophy, which teaches us that the other and the self are one and the same. And then the modern political world becomes much more intelligible with this Hegelian perspective. And from my empirical point of view, I have, in my intellectual and spiritual development, I have been opposed to everything and everyone. I have hated or disliked everything and everyone until I realized that I was everything and everyone. So I had to enter a negative relationship with the whole world before I realized that the other was a reflection of myself. And that was quite a shock. And yeah. You said that the higher self, or maybe that's me, I don't know, creates, for lack of a better word, space and time. And when one experiences a mystical experience, which is a speculative understanding, time and space are abolished, and the reality, the speculative reality of the world is revealed, and time, space, causality become dubious categories. And the question of how the absolute ego manifests a world within time and space is a mystery to me. But yeah. To create means to suffer, because to create something means to create something out of nothing, and you have to negate the nothingness to bring forth a creative act. And a creator is a suffering entity. And I believe that the reason why mankind suffers is because the creator, which is the highest self of all there is, he himself suffered in his act of creation. And then I wrote that it is tempting to use the absolute ego to say the absolute ego wants this or that, or the absolute ego does this or that, but actually it's impossible to use the absolute ego. It's the absolute ego, or reason in the language of Hegel, which uses the little self, which is the cunning of reason. And in my empirical development, I have been tempted many times to say, reason made me do this, made me do that, so I am putting the blame on reason. But maybe someday reason will put the blame on me, and I will have to be held accountable for reason itself, and that's difficult. But I wrote that I want, but I've already said it, but I want to possess the other intellectually. And in this sense, I want to annihilate not the other, but I want to annihilate the otherness of the other. I want the other to remain existent, but I want the other to lose his sense of self and to equalize myself with the other. And this is kind of a negative will, which brings about equality and freedom and spirit. And I also wrote, and that's kind of scary, because I believe that, and that's one of the biggest mysteries as of now, that this will that I have to possess the other, what I call my higher self, which is reason, and in the highest sense it is God, although strictly speaking God does not yet exist as God, but that God, for lack of a better word, wants to possess me. And God knows everything about me, because all my fears, God is aware of them. And yeah. And there's a song by Lady Gaga, Paparazzi, and here are the lyrics. And like I said, in my view of German idealism and Hegel's philosophy, which is cultural Hegelianism, modern pop culture is a mode of manifestation of absolute spirit to itself. And that's why many people love modern pop culture. And my purpose is to show the logical ideas at work within modern pop culture and within art in general, and to show them, to give a sensuous presentation to the philosophical ideas. And Lady Gaga, in this song, Paparazzi, she says, "I'm your biggest fan. I will follow you until you love me. Promise I will be kind, but I won't stop until that boy is mine." And this will to possess, it is my will as an individual. I want to possess the other, and I am making this video because in a way I want to possess your mind. But by doing this, it is actually reason which is using me, because reason wants to possess me as an individual. So what I do to the other, reason do it to me, and that's the cunning of reason. And when I understood this by listening to this song, I had a revelation, because I wondered, but why would God or reason possess me as an empirical individual? Why would reason follow me until reason possesses me completely. Because in the philosophy of Hegel, the negative is an individual, reason is an individual, but Hegel says that this individual is contingent and irrelevant, and that he must negate his own selfhood. And I understand that it is partly true, but what I don't understand is that the relationship between my empirical self, with my own psychology, my own history, my own tastes and desires, my own fears, my own passions, is the world, which I know is a reflection of reason, is the world determined by the mind of this empirical me? That I don't know yet, but yeah. I said that reason, or spirit, or God, is a totalitarian mind who wants to possess and to master the world, to become the intellectual owner of the world, and it includes owning the negative within the world. I wrote that Lady Gaga illuminated me, and that's German idealism. And as of now, I must be honest, and I must admit that Lady Gaga is amazing as an artist. It's breathtaking, and her creativity is amazing. And I believe that the only way to truly appreciate Lady Gaga is through the mediation of German idealism, and that's the whole purpose of cultural Hegelianism, to show the unity of the highest speculative German philosophy with modern pop culture. And I want to show you, Matthew, the popular aspect of German idealism, and my ultimate purpose is to show to the masses who unconsciously love Lady Gaga for a reason they ignore, I want to show them the philosophical ideas at work within modern pop culture. And that's the task of German idealism, to unite the philosophers and the people in the contemplation of truth, beauty, and goodness. And hopefully this is possible. So yeah, I wrote that my view of German idealism is that the more I understand modern pop culture, the more I understand philosophy, and German idealism in particular. And my view, which is the view of the negative, my view of German idealism is the unity of Plato, Schelling, Hegel, Wordsworth, Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, Avril Lavigne, and Paine. I added that, and Paine. That's very important. But this view that I have is so amazing. It's more amazing than anything ever invented. And this view of German idealism that I have is so amazing that I feel compelled to share it with the entire world. And it is implied in the concept of cultural Hegelianism, which is my view of German idealism, to conquer in thought and to convert in mind the whole world to my religion and my philosophy, which is, if it is really a religion and a philosophy, it's not mine, but it is the philosophy and the religion of God himself. And yeah. I wrote, by watching your video, that my greatest wish is to be able to be a cause of joy and enlightenment, joyful enlightenment in the other. I want to give joy to others by a conceptual understanding. And if the price to pay to enable this giving of joy to another, if the price to pay is self-negation. And if all things are one, the existence of the other presupposes self-negation. And if the price to pay is suffering and evil, and if suffering and evil enable the bringing forth of positivity, but a real positive, an ecstasy of conceptual understanding and joy, and I want to see myself be a cause of joy in another mind. And if this is possible, I don't know yet because I have not yet experienced it. If this is possible, and if it brings true joy, and if the price to pay is suffering, but I think that there might be a possibility that I would be willing to pay the price, because the joy would be so overwhelming that, and I wrote that the positive must come out of the negative, hopefully, but logically it should, because the negative cannot be thought of without the positive. So from a logical standpoint, from a speculative standpoint, the negative, which is my empirical self, must be able to bring forth the positive into the world. I also wrote that I am afraid of Hegel. I have an ambiguous relationship with Hegel because he scares me. You said that the purpose of the absolute ego was to annihilate nature, and it is what Novalis said, that we should seek to idealize nature, to spiritualize nature, to romanticize nature. And the empirically minded, atheistic, rationalistic, in the modern sense of rationality, scientists, they also seek to annihilate nature, and the physicality of the world disappears almost completely through the thinking activity of the mind of the physicist. And the modern physicists who think that philosophy is just babbling nonsense, mumbo jumbo, and that I read that in Stephen Hawking, who said that since Kant there hasn't been any good philosopher except Wittgenstein. I simplify, he did not really say that, but the modern scientists disregard philosophy as being some sort of armchair, a priori theorizing of worthless use, but they are the most brilliant minds, people with IQs of 160, 165, the most brilliant geniuses in the world today, they are unconsciously spiritualizing nature. And I remember reading in The System of Transcendental Idealism by Schelling, that Schelling envisioned a view where, through a thinking activity, mind would remove the content of nature to bring forth only the form of thought. It would idealize nature through a cognitive process. And this view of the intellectualization of the material world is what the modern empirically minded physicists do unconsciously. And they cannot understand their life and their work and their place within the world without understanding German idealist philosophy. And they will understand one day that they had been working for Hegel all along. And hopefully they appreciate German humor. Yeah. On a more serious note, from a cosmological Darwinian perspective, which is the perspective of everyday consciousness, that we emerge from the Big Bang and from the evolution of chemistry and the bringing forth of life, and life brings about higher organisms which produce apes and man and consciousness and intelligence. In this perspective, I said in a previous video that eugenics must be understood as a moment when nature reflects upon itself and makes the conscious will, which is determined by the laws of nature. But the eugenicists were not familiar with Fichte or Schelling, but yeah, we must put the eugenic movement within the context of the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of nature, yeah, of shelling. And eugenics is a negative moment because it produced hatred and will to eliminate the weak and megalomania within some scientific circles, and it brought about political and historical negative aspects. But I am the negative, and I must accept this moment as being part of the process of world consciousness and world spirit becoming conscious of itself. And one cannot understand the intellectual history of the West if one does not understand that since the end of the Second World War, the scientific world has been shaped by a rejection of eugenics because of the excesses of the National Socialist regime. And if one wants to understand, maybe I'm the only one, but I want to understand the world, and the vision that I have is that if history is rational, it's backward, it's reason projecting itself backward in time, because reason is consciousness, and yeah, the eugenic movement must be understood in some sort of a Fichtean and Schellinian perspective, and Hegelian perspective also. It is nature becoming conscious of itself and wishing to realize is self-improvement through the use of its own laws to increase consciousness, beauty, strength. And this excess, this hubris, brought forth its negation, and the modern world in the West is opposed generally to eugenics, and one cannot understand the political and intellectual history of the West if one does not understand this moment, this negative moment, as being part of the process. But the second moment is that when one understands this, one understands that nature is not the primordial element which brings forth consciousness and mind. It is mind which sets nature. But one has to go through the chronological process at first, and only then one realizes that history, cosmological history, is a backward projection of reason in time to give itself a presentation of its own logical laws and its own development. You talked about two infinitely opposed forces, and they are being and nothing, and in the form of repulsion and attraction, and the positive and the negative, identity and difference, and eros and thanatos. And these opposing forces are within God. God is a dialectical, self-negating, self-opposed process. And I express a wish. I don't know if it's meaningful, but I hope that the unity of positive and negative triumphs over the division, and that the unity of identity and difference, which is the formal definition of the absolute for Hegel, the identity of identity and difference predominates over the difference. And that I made videos in which I said that God is a loving fire, a burning, ardent, passionate love, and passion is painful, but if it is love, hopefully love triumphs over everything, including the negative. I wrote, hopefully I won't hate myself too much, but I don't know if hope is a relevant logical category. You expressed the Schellinian view of the philosophy of nature. It's light which wants to expand and to go out of itself. And you will be surprised to find that in the philosophy of Jakob Böhm, there were already these principles, the sour, sweet, and bitter. It was a primordial conflict within the Godhead, and he used alchemical determinations to express the process of God. And Hegel replaced the alchemical determinations by logical ones. And there is an inner conflict within the mind of God, and if the world, it's not if, the world is the reflection of the mind of God, and there are conflicts within nature and within the spiritual realm, within human activity, which are a reflection of the internal conflicts within God, because God is a conflictual entity, and which solves its own contradiction by love, but it does not erase the moment of the negative. And so light wants to expand, to open, but light needs to oppose itself to itself in order to become conscious of its own brilliance. Because if there was only light and nothing else, one wouldn't see anything. Light needs non-light, which is darkness or matter, in order to become conscious of its own brilliance. And gravity, in the view of Schelling, was a pull into oneself, into itself. It's an internal will to remain within oneself. And this is the principle of evil for Hegel, the principle of the negative. And an equilibrium is reached within matter. And I wrote that the conflict in the natural world between light and gravity, or light and matter, is the manifestation in the realm of spirit between the tendencies of spirit to be serious, and I would say deadly serious, and the will to be comical, because spirit in his best moment is very funny, is very light-hearted, and that's the conflict in the Schellingian view between light and gravity. And electromagnetism, in the view of Schelling, again, is an attempt to find balance and equilibrium, and in polarity and chemistry. And what Hegel says, that the concept is the logical, intellectual manifestation of polarity, because the concept is a unity of opposite determinations, and must become conscious of itself by understanding his unity with the world. And what Hegel calls the concept is the logical equivalent of the unity of polarity within the realm of logic. And electromagnetism probably is the manifestation of the polarity of mind, of the divine mind within the realm of nature. That's a hypothesis. I am not yet sure. And you said that then it brings forth chemistry. And there's a German theologian of the 18th century, Oettinger, who said that chemistry and theology were one and the same. That's probable, because I know that when we experience chemical balance within our brain, when the neural structure of our brain is balanced, we experience joy. And when it is imbalanced, we experience anxiety, suffering, depression, anger, and the negative emotions. And what I understood is that the modern neurobiologists have a materialist view, but they understand in the realm of materialism what is true in the realm of logic. And in truth, matter and nature are a reflection of the idea, and when the logical idea is balanced, which happens in speculative understanding, when the opposite determinations, which are separated by der Verstand, are grasped in their conceptual unity, we are enlightened and we perceive a speculative truth, and this logical unity is reflected by chemical processes within the brain, and it means that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are balanced and are functioning in a unity. And this is when we open our third eye, as the mystics speak, which is actually speculative logic being reflected in the realm of chemistry. And yeah. And then you said that chemistry brings forth life in the realm of irritability, sensibility, and I add reproduction, because I am sharing knowledge, because we are one being becoming conscious of itself. And as an empirical individual, when I read Hegel talk about irritability, sensibility, and reproduction, I don't understand what he means. But thanks to you, I understand that he took his inspiration from Schelling, and now it makes sense. And you talk about the life force, the formative power, and I have read Fichte, and he says that in his view, the vegetable nature is the result of a formative force within nature, that animal life is a result of a moving, self-moving force, and that man and consciousness is the result of a thinking force within nature, so that in the cosmological Darwinian perspective, which culminates in Fichte, although he had no idea of Darwinism, but that was the beginning of an evolutionary thinking in a way, there was a potential for thought within the primordial cosmic evolution, because it became effective, so it was potential. What has become effective is a potentiality being made manifest. So in this cosmological view, thought and consciousness were potentially contained within the early instance of the Big Bang, because the proof that they were potentially there is that they became effective some 13 billion years later. And the modern physicists are trying to solve the problem of the anthropic principle. How come that our universe was made in such a way that it enabled human consciousness? If there is no God, how do you explain that the laws of physics are so finely tuned that they enable the production of human consciousness? But that's an attempt in the realm of ordinary consciousness, with very intelligent men, of course, but with an ordinary consideration of things, to solve the problems of existence, of why is there something capable of perceiving an objective world. But the real solution to this enigma and to this mystery is to adopt the position of German idealism and the position of the negative, which thinks that, and the position of reason, which believes that the world is projected in a mysterious way that I don't yet understand, but it is the consciousness which projects a world. And yeah, I will stop there for now. I will make a third video because I have many things to say, and I want to share my understanding with you, because you have shared your understanding with the world, and I am part of the world, and I have used your perspective on things to improve my understanding. And now my job is to give you back what you gave me, and to enlighten you, hopefully, and to try to bring forth the positive out of my negative relationship to the substance. So yeah.